One mistake in this house and you don't just lose your job, you lose your shadow, the head server whispered as Alicia Gangler stepped into the Ocasio ballroom. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and a cold, metallic tension that made the champagne glasses on her tray hum. Alicia kept her gaze fixed on the floor, her burgundy uniform a splash of bruised color against the sea of black tuxedos. She just needed the shift pay. Her family's bookstore was one missed rent check away from becoming a memory, and the Ocasios paid in blood money that spent just as well as any other. Before we go into details, click subscribe, like, and comment where you're watching from. I would be glad to know this story goes as far as Canada, all of the United States of America, Australia, Africa, and even the United Kingdom, so let me know where you're listening from. The catering manager had been explicit. Don't look up, don't speak, don't exist. But as she navigated the edge of the crowd, she saw him. Gregory Ocasio, the old lion, sat alone in a carved mahogany chair. While the rest of the underworld's elite postured and preened, the patriarch looked frail, his eyes clouded with the weariness of a man who had outlived his era. Ignoring the warning bells screaming in her head, Alicia approached. She didn't see a mafia kingpin, she saw a man who looked exactly as lonely as her own grandfather had before he passed. Her tray trembled slightly as she extended a glass of vintage sparkling wine. "You look like you've seen enough war for one night, sir," she murmured, her voice a soft, dangerous breach of protocol. She didn't stop there. Driven by a memory of a bedtime story, she added the ancient Sicilian refrain, "In the end, the quietest room is the safest port." The glass in Gregory's hand didn't shatter, but his grip turned white. The room didn't just go quiet, it died. Before Gregory could speak, a tectonic grind echoed through the floorboards. Massive iron shutters began to drop over the high-arched windows, sealing the ballroom in an airtight tomb. The orchestra's violins screeched to a halt. Then the crowd parted like a dark sea. Martin Ocasio, the current boss, strode toward her. The tattoos on his neck seemed to pulse in the dimming light, and his eyes were like cold flint. He stepped into her space, his presence an overwhelming weight that forced her to look up. "Where," Martin growled, his hand disappearing into the silk lining of his jacket, "did a girl like you learn those words?" The iron shutters of the ballroom had barely locked into place before Alicia was swept upward, her feet barely touching the marble as Martin Ocasio's security team funneled her through a concealed door. She was led not to a dungeon, but to a room of suffocating luxury. Martin's private study was a cavern of dark oak, leather-bound books, and the faint, lingering scent of expensive bourbon. The door clicked shut with a finality that made her heart hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. Martin didn't sit. He paced the perimeter of the room, a predator measuring the dimensions of a new cage. When he finally turned to her, the dim lamplight caught the ink on his throat, making the tattoos of thorns and roses seem to writhe. "Empty your pockets," he commanded, his voice a low, dangerous velvet. Alicia's hands shook as she produced a crumpled bus pass, a set of keys with a brass book charm, and a single peppermint. No weapons, no wires. Martin snatched the keys, his eyes narrowing at the bookstore logo. He tossed them onto the desk and stepped into her personal space, looming so close she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "The empty silent pass isn't something a waitress picks up at a diner, Alicia. It hasn't been used since the 1920s Sicilian underground. It's a code of blood loyalty, reserved for those who saved the life of an Ocasio patriarch." He leaned down, his face inches from hers. "Who are you working for? Moretti? The Federals?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Alicia gasped, her back hitting the cold glass of a bookshelf. "My grandfather, he used to say it to me when I couldn't sleep. He said it was a prayer for peace. He was just a baker, Mr. Ocasio. Please, I just want to go home." Martin searched her face, looking for the flicker of a lie, the telltale twitch of a trained operative. Instead, he found only wide-eyed, genuine terror and the desperate honesty of the innocent. A strange shadow passed over his features, a realization that was almost more unsettling than his anger. "And Baker," Martin repeated softly, his gaze dropping to her trembling hands. "What was his name?" "Elias Gangler," she whispered. Martin froze. He turned to a safe hidden behind a painting of a Sicilian coastline, his fingers moving with practiced precision. He pulled out a yellowed photograph, older than the house itself. In it, a young Gregory Ocasio stood beside a man with the same gentle eyes as Alicia. "You really don't know," Martin murmured, more to himself than to her. "You think you're a ghost in a burgundy vest, but you're the only person in the world my father owes a debt he can never repay." The silence in the study was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that sounded like a countdown. Martin remained by the safe, his silhouette framed by the amber glow of the desk lamp. He shed his suit jacket, tossing it onto a leather armchair, and began to unbutton his cuffs. Alicia watched, her breath hitching, as he rolled his sleeves past his elbows, revealing arms encased in a tapestry of black and gray ink. "Most people see these and see a monster," Martin said, his voice dropping to a gravelly intimacy. He stepped back into the light, gesturing for her to look closer. "In our world, we don't trust paper. Paper burns, it rots, but blood and ink, they stay." He turned his arm, showing her a dense thicket of thorns that climbed toward his shoulder. As her eyes adjusted, Alicia realized the tattoos weren't just decorative, they were a ledger. Names, dates, and coordinates were woven into the shadows of the art. It was a cartography of crime and survival. "Every major turning point for the Ocasios is etched here," he explained, pointing to a small, intricate depiction of a wheat sheaf hidden behind a coil of barbed wire near his inner wrist. "Your grandfather, Elias, wasn't just a baker, Alicia. He was the shadow that stood between my father and a life sentence. When the commission moved to dismantle us in the 20s, it was Elias who stepped into the light so Gregory could vanish into the dark. He took the fall, he took the prison time, and he took the secrets of our land deeds with him." Martin took a step closer, his scent of sandalwood and rain-drenched pavement clinging to him. He reached out, his thumb grazing the pulse point at her wrist, his touch surprisingly steady. "You've been living in a tiny apartment, struggling to save a bookstore, while you've been walking on a legacy of gold. You aren't just a guest in this house, Alicia. According to the map on my skin and the blood in your veins, you're the only person who can truly bring the Ocasios to their knees." The neon sign of Gangler's books flickered, casting a weak, dying pulse over the dust-covered classics. Alicia sat behind the counter, the weight of Martin's revelations pressing harder on her chest than the threat of his family. She clutched the brass book charm on her keys, trying to reconcile the grandfather who baked almond biscotti with the shadow boss etched into a Mafia kingpin's skin. The bell above the door chimed, but it wasn't a late-night reader who entered. 3 men in heavy overcoats stepped out of the drizzle. They didn't look at the books, they looked at Alicia with a hungry, calculated precision. "The Ocasio good luck charm," the lead man sneered, his voice like grinding gravel. "Moretti sends his regards. He thinks it's time the debt was transferred." Before Alicia could scream, the front window detonated. Shards of glass rained down like diamonds as a black SUV breached the storefront. The Moretti soldiers scrambled, reaching for their waistbands, but they were too slow. A heavy, rhythmic thrum of suppressed gunfire tore through the air, shredding the rare editions and the mahogany shelves Alicia had spent years polishing. Through the smoke and the smell of ozone, Martin Ocasio appeared. He looked like a god of ruin, a rifle gripped in his tattooed hands. He didn't offer a greeting. He grabbed Alicia by the waist, hauling her behind the cover of the armored vehicle, just as a Molotov cocktail shattered in the philosophy section. "My books!" Alicia cried, watching the flames lick the edges of her childhood memories. "Martin, stop them!" "It's over, Alicia," Martin growled, his eyes reflecting the growing inferno. He pulled a silver lighter from his pocket and flicked it open. "The Ocasios know who you are now. This shop is a bullseye, not a sanctuary." With a flick of his wrist, he tossed the lighter into a puddle of spilled gasoline. The bookstore erupted, the heat of the blast pushing them towards the street. As the orange glow turned the night into day, Martin forced her into the back of the SUV. He leaned over her, his shadow swallowing her whole. "I'm not just rescuing you," he whispered as the tires screeched towards the safety of the Ocasio estate. "I'm burning the bridge to the girl you used to be. From tonight on, you live in my world." The Ocasio estate was no longer a gilded cage, it had become a classroom of shadows. While the scent of smoke still clung to Alicia's hair, Gregory Ocasio moved her from the servants' quarters to a sun-drenched terrace overlooking the sprawling Sicilian-style gardens. The old lion sat with a deck of worn cards and a ledger that smelled of ancient cedar. He didn't teach her how to fire a weapon or how to intimidate a rival. Instead, he taught her the art of the quiet hand. "A loud man is a hunted man," Gregory wheezed, his eyes sharpening as he watched her study a map of the city's logistical arteries. "Your grandfather understood that true power isn't the fist that strikes, it's the shadow that moves the floor beneath the striker's feet." Day after day, Alicia absorbed the old ways, the subtle language of favors, the leverage found in a man's pride, and the ability to listen to what was left unsaid. She found that her natural shyness, the very thing she had once considered a flaw, was her greatest weapon. She could sit in a room and become part of the architecture, gathering secrets that men would never whisper to a more dominant presence. From the doorway, Martin watched her. He was a man built for the storm, a creature of violence and ink, yet he found himself increasingly anchored by Alicia's quiet gravity. He watched her challenge his father's logic with a soft-spoken question that left the old man grinning with pride. He saw her face the family's lieutenants, men who could kill with a look and hold their gaze with a stillness that commanded more respect than a raised voice. One evening, as the Mediterranean sun dipped below the horizon, Martin approached her at the terrace stone railing. He reached out, his tattooed hand hesitant, before he tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "My father thinks you're a strategist," Martin murmured, his voice losing his usual jagged edge. "But I see something else. I see a woman who survived the fire I started and came out forged in steel." Alicia didn't flinch from his touch. She looked at him with the keen, observant eyes Gregory had trained, seeing the vulnerability beneath the boss's armor. In that moment, the balance of power shifted. Martin wasn't just her protector anymore. He was a man falling for the very strength he had tried to cage. The Red Gala lived up to its name before a single drop of blood was shed. The ballroom was draped in crimson silk, a sea of roses masking the scent of the betrayal thickening the air. Alicia stood on the mezzanine, no longer in a servant's burgundy, but in a gown of obsidian lace that Gregory had insisted she wear. She watched the Moretti family enter, their smiles too wide, their eyes darting toward the security alcoves. Using the quiet hand her grandfather's friend had taught her, she saw the shift in the room's rhythm, the way the Ocasio guards were being subtly lured away from the main exits. The trap snapped shut at midnight. A high-frequency whine tore through the speakers, followed by the jagged crack of suppressed gunfire. The chandeliers flickered and died, plunging the room into a hellish twilight. "Moretti!" Martin's voice boomed through the chaos, a primal roar that drew every barrel in the room toward his position. He stood in the center of the dance floor, a silhouette of defiance, shielding his father as the Moretti assassins closed the circle. Alicia's instinct was to run. The service tunnel behind the velvet curtains was a direct path to the gardens, to the street, to a life where she was once again just a girl who loved books. She gripped the key of solace, the heavy, ancient skeleton key Gregory had pressed into her palm that morning, and looked toward the darkness. But then she saw Martin. He was fighting with a desperate, scorched-earth ferocity, his movements a blur of ink and steel. He looked at her once through the smoke, his eyes not pleading for help, but silently commanding her to survive, even if it meant leaving him behind. He was the monster who had burned her bookstore, the man who had stolen her peace, yet he was also the only person who had ever seen her true strength. "The quietest room," she whispered to the shadows, the key biting into her skin. She didn't run for the exit. She dove into the service crawlspace, moving with the lethal grace of someone who knew the estate's hidden veins better than the men trying to conquer it. She didn't need a gun to win a war. She reached the master override panel, the heart of the house's total lockdown protocol. Alicia paused, her finger hovering over the red toggle. To pull it meant sealing herself inside the slaughterhouse with the man she loved. She pulled the lever. The Ocasio estate had never been so still. A year had passed since the iron shutters of the Red Gala had become the teeth of a trap, crushing the Moretti insurgency in a single, calculated stroke. Now the air no longer smelled of gunpowder and old secrets, but of salt air and blooming jasmine. The sprawling ballroom, once a place of invisible servants and whispered threats, had been transformed into the nerve center of a legitimate global security empire. Alicia sat at a small, circular table on the private terrace, the same place where Gregory had once taught her the language of shadows. She no longer wore the burgundy vest of a girl hiding from the world. Her silk suit was the color of deep midnight, sharp and unapologetic. Across from her, Martin sat with his sleeves rolled up, the map of ink on his arms now a history book rather than a blueprint for war. He watched her over the rim of his espresso cup, his flint-like eyes softened by a devotion that bordered on reverence. "The final audit on the land deeds is complete," Alicia said, her voice steady and resonant. She slid a single document across the table. "The bookstore's original site has been deeded back to the city for a public library. The blood debt Gregory owed my grandfather is officially marked as paid in full." Martin reached out, his hand covering hers. His thumb traced the line of her knuckles, a gesture of grounding warmth. "He would be proud, Alicia, not because you saved the money, but because you saved the name." In the years since the lockdown, Alicia had done what 3 generations of Ocasio men could not. She had moved the family into the light. Her shyness had evolved into a lethal observational brilliance that allowed her to dismantle rival threats before they even drew breath. She didn't lead with a fist, she led with the quiet hand, turning their violent world into a private security powerhouse that the law could no longer touch. As the sun began to set over the Sicilian coastline, Martin stood and pulled out her chair. He didn't lead her like a captive or a trophy, he walked beside her as an equal. The shy waitress who had once begged to be invisible had found her voice, and in doing so she had become the matriarch of mercy. "The house is quiet tonight," Martin whispered, leaning into her. Alicia smiled, looking out over the empire she had reshaped. "In the end," she replied, "the quietest room really is the safest port."